So, what, in many ways, some of the principles that Tim's been outlining, I want to build on those, but very much to look at it now from a language teacher's perspective, but also from the classroom itself, because all of my research that I've ever done has always been with teachers and with learners in classrooms, including learners as researchers. And I do think that we really are, despite all the background and context, I do think that language teachers now, and I read from this, what language teachers can do to support language-aware learning and literacies across the curriculum, and why it is so important for deeper learning and celebrating, developing and using children's diversity and multilingualism. I want to begin with just a very small reflection. Sure, we live in a changing world and it's really very rapidly changing. I can walk along the main street in Edinburgh, along Princes Street, and I hear just as much Polish as I do Scots. And by the way, Scots is also a language. It's part of our 1+2 policy, as along with Doric. Is Doric a language or is it a... Well, we don't go there. We know about the shifts in landscape. We know about them, we're very familiar with them. And also, I'm joining with the conversation I had this morning and also with the previous speaker about this whole business about 21st century education. I think we've got to stop it. Besides which, it's now 2018, which means that we're well into the 21st century. And if we're really focusing on language, then, you know, research tells us an awful lot about language, and it also tells us a lot about learning. And would you believe, it tells us a lot about language learning. And I think because it's now acceptable that we're living in a pluricultural and plurilingual world, then I think this has got to impact on our pedagogies. And for me, the one thing that hasn't really changed is what happens as a classroom teacher when we close our doors. And I think this is about empowering teachers to do things slightly differently, but not to change radically some of the things that have gone on that work incredibly well. So for me, it's around the value systems that underpin what we do and why we do it. And there we have the 4 pillars for learning. And I do think that now we have a wonderful opportunity to re-look at the role of language. Because for me, I'm biased. Everybody says I'm biased, but for me, language is the core of learning, and it's the core of education. And it's absolutely fundamental for deeper learning. And deeper learning is where we assimilate and we automatize those concepts rather than at the surface. So the trouble is we've had labels, and labels and trends go and come and go. And, you know, having done a lot of work and often been associated with the concept of CLIL, quite recently I had an article rejected from an erudite journal. It was later rescinded, but nonetheless, because I hadn't defined CLIL. And to me, this is the problem, that our systems are so variable. And we talked about it again this morning, saying that actually one size does not fit all. But in terms of our context, that is where it all happens. And that interpretation of our context and working with the variables that we have mean that at our peril, do we say, oh yes, I do communicative language teaching, I do task-based learning, because those labels don't actually tell us very much about the principles, because we are the principles. We are the ones that decide on what those principles are, and we're guided from various theories and research. I was interested as well in phenomenon-based learning, so everybody's getting excited, or not, as the case may be, about Finland. And, you know, as we know, Finland is or was something to be really admired, a country whose education system was incredibly successful. But again, we can't just compare, just because Finland is doing it, we can't just compare ourselves with Finland, wherever we are in the world, because, again, we have our own set of principles, we have our own set of youngsters, young people with whom we work. And I'm also very interested in this business about a skills-based curriculum, because as far as I'm concerned, if you have curriculum stated as knowledge, then you need the application of that. And if you have application without any knowledge, then, you know, what is all this about? And I would argue that this has been one of the challenges for language teachers and language learning over the centuries. So what is the content of our language learning? We can do all the skills, and we know about working with skills, but if we're not actually creating new knowledge, if we're not making meaning for our pupils, for our students, then what is the point? So this is where I'm at, and if you don't take down anything else, please take this down. So, neither the theorization of learning nor of language on its own is sufficient to provide an adequate account of second language learning for contemporary times, and that a more interdisciplinary approach to language and learning is required. We can have coffee now if you like. So, in the literature, there's been a lot of work recently done on ecologies, and despite the fact that I'm hesitant about jumping on bandwagons, I have to say that I find the concept of learning ecologies really helpful, because to me what that says is if we look at successful learning, whether it's in first language, second language, third language, or all of them, then it's not dependent on one factor. And we've known that as educationalists forever. But it seems to me that many of the theories that we look to only deal with certain elements of learning. And I do think that ecologies are what goes on in our classrooms with our learners. Whether they're 2 or whether 22 or 102, it's what matters. And so I do think that ecologies are really, really helpful. And 3 weeks ago, there was a working document came out. Do have a look at it. And its recommendations are as follows. To improve language competence, yes, of course. Of course we're going to be about improving language competence. But what does that mean in terms of skills, or is it the ability to apply knowledge through language? And I think that is something that really needs to be looked at. And to broaden the scope of language teaching. To ensure schools are aware of the linguistic diversity in their pupil population, of course, but yet how often do I go to schools where I have posters saying hello in 20 different languages and so on, but what does that really mean? And, it's a bit of a struggle to get away from the deficit model. Well, these children, these newly arrived, don't speak English. We've got to get them up to English as quickly as possible. Very much the deficit is shifting slightly, rather than seeing them as a resource and as a very rich enabling, really, for perhaps monolingual or different bilingual learners in the same class. Offering them opportunities to create language-rich learning environments where multilingualism can flourish and the language of schooling can be adequately supported. So language-aware schools where it's integrating language learning across the curriculum. And I do think that as language teachers, we have a huge opportunity and responsibility here. Okay? The second highlight is support teachers of other subjects than modern languages to gain language awareness. And I use that term carefully. I don't think it means language awareness as we had in the 80s and 90s, but to actually understand how language works, and I'll say more about that later, and knowledge about language didactics. So, literacies. Interesting, because so often literacies may often be interpreted as learning to read and write, and this is not at all what I'm looking at here. And in fact, what I want to do is to show you how the development of literacies is going more towards pluriliteracies. What does that mean? Growth principles and deeper learning. So, OECD 2016, proficiency in several information processing skills, literacy, numeracy, problem solving. We've already thought about that and the implications of it this morning. However, in the 90s, something really important happened to me in the European Union. So the languages of schooling came as a concept of putting all language together into one concept. And I do think that this is absolutely crucial. Language teaching can no longer be seen as something done in a classroom separate from other subjects. For equity and quality in education for all, we need to infuse attention to language into our classrooms across the years and disciplinary areas of schooling. And that has now developed significantly, and I'll refer later on to the 80s and the Bullock report. So basically what it's saying now is that we cannot remain as a hermetically sealed bubble. We have to change what we're doing, and that involves growth mindset. So what do you see on there? I mean, I find it really hard. I can only see, well, I can see the rabbit easier than I can see anything else, but nonetheless, it's about seeing, knowing, being, and using those different lenses. It's also about debunking some of the myths about what we mean by integrated learning pedagogic approaches. So it's to do with growth and mindset, and teachers are good at that. And as language teachers, we have an opportunity to do this across languages. So, growth principles then. Languages are our greatest learning tool. I would argue that forever. I do, and I think that happens to all learners. I was very interested in the train as I rumbled through March and Ely last night. There was a man sitting opposite me who was a signer. We do a lot of work on British signing in our university, and one of the key elements at the moment is ensuring that signing, how do you ensure that the conceptual depth of science can be translated into signing? It's very interesting. An integrated approach to language using is for all learners in all languages. And language learning and language using are not monolingual processes. Whoever says that you're not allowed to use certain languages, to me, it's very odd. And I do think whilst we might want our classrooms, if we're teaching a certain language, to be rich in that language, I do not agree that we are not allowed to use other languages, although clearly we need some ground rules. And an integrated approach to learning is not the same as surface topics in the language, nor does it focus on language as a linguistic system. So, if language is a resource, we have to use it, and this is where translanguaging comes in. Grammatical chronology as the only determinant of language use is not appropriate. Okay, I can't say that enough, but that does not mean I'm anti-grammar. We still need grammar because that helps us understand process and it helps us understand linguistic systems. But if that is the only determinant, it doesn't work. Because I know some classrooms where we've been working where the first word in a new language that the children learn is why. Because as soon as you ask the question why, you've automatically then got to start using your cognitive and linguistic skills. And if you don't have them because you are a beginner, then you very quickly get up to speed and you very quickly begin to understand the functions that you need in order to get something done. And if we get it right, those integrated approaches are about effective learning. And I really believe that as language teachers, we can also work very closely with our L1 colleagues. And I do think that we can have some models for monolingual L1 learning. Okay. So, the ecologies then that I talked about are holistic. And I do think there are 4 elements of this which bring in the whole of learning. And I think this is much as what happens in a language classroom as it is in a science classroom or any other kind of classroom. So we want our learners to demonstrate understanding. We want them to generate and sustain commitment and achievement, and there's a lot of work, Carol Dweck's work and so on grit, determination. We need that kind of challenge. You know, this is where I ban the F word, and by F word I mean fun, because I'm heartily sick of trying to be the entertainer and make things fun, when you actually ask many learners, of course we all like a laugh, of course we do, but if you ask many learners, what they will say is that they like challenge, and it's that challenge that is just enough to give a real sense of achievement. Mentoring learning, yes please, not the learner. That's significantly different. We need to be mentoring learning so that, let me give you a concrete example. I was in a school quite recently and it was in a French classroom. And the teacher had said something like, apologies if you don't understand French, but it's very simple. Où est le garçon? Where's the boy? Oh, yes. Il est dans le jardin. Oh, mais c'est très bien. I am sorry, but il est dans le jardin is not très bien. It never was and it never will be. And it technically, if you saw it written down, might have been correct. It means he is in the garden, but not il est dans le jardin, but il est dans le jardin is not correct. And so what I'm about here is saying, well, you know what? That's not a bad answer, but I think we can make it better. So how are we going to make that better? And that principle is not talking down to children or to adults. It's really something that people want to do because they want to get better. So I think mentoring learning is something that we could get much better at, and building knowledge and refining skills. And for that, I'm not going into it in any detail, and in fact, it's probably not very clear anyway, but the pluri-literacies model that I'm working on in a trans-European group is actually looking at how we're going to bring all those together. Don't worry about that because I'm going to just focus on 2 aspects of it. So, if we assume that good learning is about deep learning, then language learning is all about deep learning. We are not aware of any evidence or explicit and detailed claims that the correction of errors of grammatical form is a sufficient condition for the development of oral and written language as a medium of learning. Notice there, it's not saying it's no good, but it is saying it is not sufficient. So we've got to look at what we're doing and how we're correcting it. And neither should we let ourselves, and I love this quote, I'd have it on my forehead if I could, we should not let ourselves be trapped inside a dichotomy between focus on form and focus on meaning. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Is it about content or is it about language? Come on, you can't separate them. You cannot. But what you can do is make sure that learners, even with minimal amounts of language, are accessing concepts which are appropriate for their age range. I'm sorry, but when I go into a classroom and somebody's excited because the children have been doing a poster, and a poster on the wall is about sustainability. These are with 12-year-olds, beginner learners of a language, and we have a picture of a seal and a picture of a polar bear and the word underneath it. I'm sorry, that is not appropriate. It's not appropriate for a 12-year-old in another language to be creating posters about something as fundamental as sustainability using a picture and a word. That is okay for P1s, P2s, year 1s and year 2s, I suppose, in 4 or 5-year-olds. That is great, but not for 12-year-olds. So if we want them to be appropriately accessing the kind of language issues that they need to be talking about, then it means that not only do we have that a sort of a guided construction about the grammatical functions, that has to turn on its head, because actually I need the past tense much more quickly. In fact, I need it immediately rather than waiting. So a lot of work was done in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s on the 4Cs framework, which was devised with Spanish teachers, actually, of English, and we looked at what would help teachers move away from focus on content or focus on form. And the 4Cs came into being. These don't tell you how to do things, and teachers have found them very useful. But straight away, our first one, and again, this was discussed this morning, knowledge isn't just facts, and there are different kinds of knowledges, okay? And whether or not you agree with the delineation of factual, conceptual, and procedural metacognitive knowledges, actually, those kind of knowledges require different kinds of language. So if we're wanting our students to access concepts, we've got to make sure that they can access the language that enables them to articulate them, to learn them, and to deepen them. And if we don't do that, we're resting at surface learning. I remember distinctly, I had a very good short-term memory, which is probably why I did so well at school, because it had nothing to do with how clever you were. It was just really good for taking tests and exams. And I do remember that we were dealing with the principle of Archimedes, right? If a body is wholly or partly immersed in a fluid, it appears to lose weight, and the apparent loss in weight is equal to the volume of the liquid displaced. Right, I can remember that. That's in the memory box, long-term memory box. However, it was meaningless until we had a teacher who told us to go home, and our homework was to run a bath, because in those days you had baths, you didn't have showers. So you had to go home, run a bath, sit in the bath, and lift your right leg out of the bath. And hey presto, what happens? Of course, the volume displaces, your leg feels heavy, and suddenly all that understanding comes into being. And then we had to put that into our own words, which equaled if a body is wholly or partly immersed. But it was in our own words. And then we're looking at cognition. And yes, we've got all the stuff on Bloom and so on. That's fine. We know about problem solving, creative skills, and all of this is to do with meaning making. But how can you do that if you haven't got the linguistic tools to do it? We need those tools. And then Hattie's work that you may be familiar with, it was all about how to make learning visible. And this is the second thing that I come on to that I really, really value, that has come, it's always been around, but the label that it's now got, I think is, despite what I said about labels, I think is helpful. So when learners put into their own words what they've learned, and when the language they use is at an appropriate level of sophistication for the subject or thematic element of the curriculum according to the age and level of learners. And I go back here in the language classroom to the sustainability poster. That is not appropriate for 12-year-olds. The sophistication is not there, even as beginners. There's many other things that you can do as a beginner with limited language. I don't know whether you know books like The Rabbits, for example, Sean Tan's book. But I mean, if ever you want something that really, really deals in very simple linguistic terms, but with very, very deep concepts, then, there are examples. So, to language is a verb. And languaging, to me, is very, very closely connected to assessment. Because if we're getting learners to language what they think they have learned in their own words, in whatever language you are working in, and sometimes that might be translanguaging because they might have to revert to a different language, then we know what they have learned because they're telling us. And if it's around the progression in tasks, the design of tasks and activities, then we need to be enabling them to language. And, communication, yes, it's about language learning, of course it is, but it's also about language using. And the two are not necessarily always the same. I think practice is really important. I've got two very keen hobbies, and they require a lot of practice, and I practice those almost every day. I'm not bored by it because I know I need to do that in order to get better. I'm motivated to do it. And therefore, I think that, this isn't about memorization. I think it's great. I think we should have more memorization, actually. But that practicing we need to have, but that can come through language using. The triptych has also been one of the tools that's been used by teachers a lot to help them get away from grammatical chronology, and language of for through is really helpful, as I'm told. Language of learning, this is for lesson planning or event planning. I don't like lesson planning. I don't see how we can possibly do all the stuff that we have to do as a lesson, as an hour. I think it's about a learning event, but anyway. Language of learning is all the language that we need that is related to the content of what we're doing. Language for learning is all the language that we need to operate effectively, so our discussion and so on. Because, again, it is not sufficient for a 12 or a 13-year-old to be saying, I like it because I like it, because that limitation on language, they've not been enabled. And language through learning is the fact that after every lesson or during each lesson, I would expect my learners to be coming up with new learning. And new learning requires new language, and where does that come from? How do I create those spaces for that to happen? And then culture, very much at two levels, the macro level where we're talking about interculturality, but also where I'm looking at specifically this morning is the micro level where we're looking at literacies, because different kinds of literacies have very much different kinds of cultures. So meaning making involves knowing, thinking, articulated in ways which demonstrate intercultural understanding and subject-appropriate discourse. That is pluriliteracies. Easy to say, but, quite difficult. So, let's have a look at this. Nobody is born speaking academic. Nobody, okay? So, it's got to be taught. Now, do we teach it as this is academic language, or do we look at it in terms of the sophistication of the concepts? Because unless we start lesson planning in terms of conceptual understanding, knowledge if you like, then there's going to be there's a gap. We're not getting deep enough into the learning. It's also a great leveler as well, because even if your classes are filled with different languages that are spoken by the learners, then academic language is new more or less for all children. However, I have to say that I disagree slightly with the way that Cummins as Bix and Kalp has been interpreted, because I do believe that Bix is just as difficult as Kalp. If you go along and start chatting about the football match last night, you very quickly get into the technicalities of who was da-da-da-da-da, and you need specialist vocabulary and knowledge for that. And so I also think that Kalp starts the moment a child steps into school, but for some it's even earlier. So if we look at science, geography, and history, you'll find if you do comparators across the curriculum, you'll find that those are very, very typical right across the board. These kinds of things happen everywhere. So if we are dealing with themes and topics in our lessons, we need to be really clear about what is going on in other areas of the curriculum so that we can build on this. And also you notice that in science, geography and history, for example, there is describing and classifying, there's identifying, there's describing and so on. In other words, the kind of higher order thinking skills that we're dealing with in our classrooms. So where is the connection? And we come to those, and you can look at those and say, yeah, we've known about those forever. Of course we have. Of course. But we also know about the characteristics of discourse-rich environments. How do we get the learners to present their ideas and explain and so on, listening carefully, critiquing. We know all of that stuff. So where do we get it from? And I would say that there are no easy materials available. And if they are materials, I think we have to sometimes transform them for ourselves. And by that, I'm not knocking here any kind of materials that are available. What I'm saying is that when you have materials that are available, you then have to do something with them to get into your ecologies for different classrooms. Then we have multilingual learners, academic literacies. So already now we're starting to shift away from the 4 skills. So where is all this? Christine Dalton-Puffer and Vollmer have done some excellent work on looking at cognitive discourse functions. And cognitive discourse functions really are the link between the different kinds of knowledges and the language that we need. And you could go back to this and say, well, yes, those are functions, they certainly are, but they're general at the moment. And what we have to do is we have to become more and more sophisticated in how they relate to the topic in what we're doing. I don't know whether some of you anyway are bilingual teachers, meaning that you teach other subjects, but I'm assuming that for the majority you are language teachers. And nobody's asking language teachers to suddenly morph into bilingual physics teachers. I mean, there are some crazy things that are going on across the world at the moment. Neither are we expecting physics teachers to suddenly become language teachers. No, we've got our own skill sets, and it's what happens when those are brought together. So, visible learning for me is this: when it connects academic language in the forms of functions demanded by the context, but here I'm talking about text, and that for me is the greatest resource that we have, subject discipline or thematic content with the language needed, learned and used, therefore making transparent for learners, with learners, subject literacies, first language, other literacies, pluriliteracies. Okay. What does dealing with text mean? Again, a shift from the dependence on grammatical chronology, and it's looking very much at genre style, register and style. And I see that at the very beginning with beginner learners, whatever their level. I think we should be aware of genre, register and style. I think it's taking meaning making very seriously and enabling that authenticity and I come back again to my posters. I don't know why that poster got to me so much. I think it was the disconnect between that sense of pride that look what my learners have done, and my inward heart sinking to my boots, thinking, yes, but, So understanding what deeper learning actually means and connecting with first language literacies. Now, we can do that, and using digital means to transform materials into resources. So, rethinking task design and sequencing. Let's not forget first language literacies. And also, if we go back to the 70s, then there was the Bullock report in the UK, in England, that talked about language across the curriculum. Some of the materials that were produced at the time were incredibly good, and to be quite honest, I still use some of them, but I have to be very careful with the photos because people look like they've got very strange hairdos. But the idea was that you were actually enabling the language of science, the language of, and this can be done. We can do that in collaboration. Because I used to say, well, all teachers are language teachers, and I've stopped saying that now because I think all teachers need to be language aware. But not all teachers are language teachers. But that language awareness is crucial. And so I want to illustrate this with an example of how some of those ideas that are just kind of flying around, how can they become more practical for me in the classroom? Because if you remember what I said right at the beginning, is that what matters in our context, regardless is too strong, but obviously we take into account what the national curriculum and what our school is saying, or our schools are saying, whether they're private, whether they're individual, whether they're whatever. But it's inside the classroom where those principles or those mission statements and those values that you see plastered all over walls, that is where they're enacted. So, looking at Veal and Polyus's work, some great work has been done in Australia and New Zealand. And what they looked at was a very simple way of conceptualizing learning. And this is for learning per se. It's not in any particular subject area. And so there's doing, organising, explaining and arguing. And this is from the learner's perspective. And what they've found is that everybody's very good at doing, and to a certain extent, the learners are also helped to organise. So that's the descriptive and the taxonomic and so on. However, then it seems to dwindle. And what we do in explaining, this isn't the teacher explaining. These are the learners explaining their learning. And that is where you have sequential, causal, theoretical, factorial, all that kind of stuff. That actually, if we're serious about challenging our learners, if we're serious about giving them real-world problems to be looking at and to apply, rather than sort of almost like treating them as though because their linguistic level is low, then their cognitive level must also be low. If we're going to do that, where we have to up the game in terms of the kind of content, the kind of problem solving that goes on, and then finally the arguing. That is the challenging, the arguing, the discussion. It's not the talk to your shoulder partner about, and then you get, I like it because I like it. But it's actually analysis, it's talking to the learners. So, do you know what? What makes a really good argument? How do we know that? Let's listen to some in different languages. How can you pick that out? And it's that metacognitive awareness that is actually time really well invested. And to me, it's a little bit like this. So, I have, my Duplo car, and unfortunately, because I never got on to explaining and arguing, unfortunately, even though they're big bricks, my car doesn't quite work. And before I know what's happening, I'm going on to Lego, and Lego bricks don't fit with Duplo bricks. So I don't get that either. And then, the creme de la creme, I get onto Technic. But again, my Duplo car still doesn't work because, now, you get the idea. And if you remember right at the beginning when I showed the plural literacies model, if we're looking at just 2 dimensions of that, we're looking at knowledge construction, which is fundamental to every single teacher. Of course it is. And if we're looking at language progression, which is fundamental to every single teacher, and for us as language teachers, it's very fundamental, then look at the way that this is starting to be mapped out. And by the way, at the moment, there's a competition, I think, going on in the Netherlands to try and put this model into a 3D model, because that does not work as a flat model, because it looks as though, and also the little bubbles, although they're kind of like bubbles, it doesn't mean you've got to do everything. They're much more fluid than that, otherwise it would just be crazy. But nonetheless, if you can sort of picture this in a 3D format, what we're saying is that whatever we're doing, whatever's leading the way, and some of our lessons will be much more language-oriented, and others might be much more content-oriented, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But if we're looking at knowledge construction, and we're getting our learners to do, organize, explain, and argue the content of their learning, they will automatically have to be using the appropriate language. And that is where the glue that arcs them is always the cognitive discourse analysis, the cognitive discourse functions. What function is appropriate at this level and at this stage? And that, for me, is what learning progression is, and it involves moving from one arc to the other. So in other words, building on, again, what Tim was saying, that curriculum learning, all right, we're very, I think one of the outcomes for the previous talk was this, almost like this confusion or this intermixing between curriculum knowledge and the stuff that's got to be learned and the skills that you need, not only to understand it, but also to apply it. Then that, for me, is curriculum learning. And the language functions are what glue it together. But it's not just how to write a report, it's how to write a report if I'm at this level in my science. And if I'm 19, it's how to write a scientific report, which is appropriate to the level of the science and not at the appropriacy of the level of the language. And therefore, the functions are really vital. So, transforming the language curriculum, some transformations, they're always good as things to sort of aim towards. So, grammatical chronology into meaning making, topics into real-world issues. And again, some of you will be sitting there thinking, yeah, we've done all this before. Are we? How does it work out over a period of time? Surface learning into deep learning, balancing language learning and language using, turning our materials, and there are some brilliant materials around there at the moment, so turning those into the resources that actually apply to me in my classroom with my learners. Fun into challenge, language learners into learning partners. We've got to talk to learners about their learning and how they learn. We've got to mentor that learning. And instead of the one day, you'll be good one day, into the here and now, and all the links that are available. I know British Council do some excellent links, for example, with e-twinning. I think it's an unfortunate name, but nonetheless, it just means that we can use digital resources more often. We can link using video conferencing with real people, and they don't have to always be in the target language countries. And changing the different space into an inclusive, safe environment. So, bringing this to a close. I think we have to be critical. I think we have to look very much at lesson planning. And this is difficult because I know in a lot of schools there's a template and you have to work to the template. That might not be the case in your institution. But what is the point? And to me, assessment is for learning, or whatever you want to call it, had some really good principles, but they immediately then became formulaic. I cannot accept that 10 minutes of a lesson at the beginning are done by writing up what you're going to learn, you do some stuff, and then the last 10 minutes of the lesson is finding out whether you've learnt them or not. I am sorry, but I think that is denigratory for teachers, because as teachers we know when our learners are learning, and we'll have evidence of that learning if they are languaging their learning. So I do think that lesson planning, and I'm very much into 3D lesson planning, that's for another day, but task design and assessment being all part of that. So, finishing then. Language teachers, working with specialist teachers and first language teachers can guide progression from academic language to subject discourses around languages, across languages. Message 1, we have to define our integrated principles. We can do that. We're all knowing people, we're experts, we're teachers, we know about learning, but we have to define our principles for our classrooms, okay? Language learning and the skills base, and it doesn't matter who we are, we have to look at literacies, which takes it beyond just simply the language and into the literacies domain, looking at text and genre and so on, that are real world issues. I was in a school quite recently where they were looking at critical literacies, and the question being posed was, is terrorism ever acceptable? Number one, you very rarely get that kind of question even mooted in a school. Number two, of course, the students all said, no, of course it's not. Ah, right, well, okay, let's look at this. Let's take Nelson Mandela. Was he ever a terrorist? And that is the kind of issue and deeper thinking that I think we owe it to our learners, not necessarily that example. So, all teachers should be language-aware teachers, and remember, we're experts in that field, but where we may well be lacking is that understanding of awareness of the demands of what makes something good in history. I was working with some students in Huntly in the north of Scotland, and in their language lessons they were looking at what happened, they were working with history teachers, and the history had been looking at World War I, and they had been looking at what kind of letters the French soldiers sent home. It was very, very moving. Message 4, prioritising text, okay. 5, dialogic classrooms, talk, there's nothing new there. Our responsibility, nothing new, but I think it's good to look at ways we can be empowered to make that learning more significant. And the final key message is babies and bathwaters, because, let's not fall into the habit, oh, this is the latest trend, ecologies, literacies, languaging. Actually, let's pull back from those and identify our own principles. Alice, this is impossible, Mad Hatter, only if you believe it is. Thank you very much.